Hajime!
Good evening, Legionaries. This is, as always, General Lance, followed with you here, Sergeant Barnes, and we're greeted by a special guest. I honestly, an honor to have him here. I've been listening to his stuff for years now, and my boys have been sick of me shilling his stuff. I love his stuff, but thank you so much. This is Cost of Glory coming on. Alex Petcass, hello.
Pleasure to be here, Lance. Thanks for having me on.
Great. Yeah, honestly, I'm so honored to have you on, and I really appreciate it. But just for those who are not really aware of what you do and what your general mission statement is, maybe you introduce your project and what started it, what it is, and what's your background.
Yeah. And I got to say, it's great to see you cracking, and that the powers that be haven't corrupted your precious bodily fluids yet.
That's
and,
right.
You're still strong and vigorous.
Yes.
So
I deny essence.
Yes, deny them your essence. They see your power, but you deny them your essence. Yeah. So I am former academic. I left academia a couple of years ago. So I have a PhD in classics from one of those formerly prestigious institutions. You had Quintus Curtius on here recently, and he's a mutual of mine on Twitter, and I like and respect him a lot and his work. And, I kind of had a similar maybe story in that, the more I learned about the Greeks and the Romans, I studied this stuff because I didn't know anything. Nobody ever taught me about this stuff when I was in middle school and high school, beyond a couple of fragments, even though I studied Latin a little bit. But, the more I got into the ancient world, the more I just became convinced that academia and the kind of scholarly, industrial complex that I was inhabiting was completely missing the point of all that we were doing and why it was so important. And so, I left in 2020. I left a tenure track job, and people thought I was crazy. But I started this podcast as a side project, and putting basically storytelling about what I thought was the most important thing, which is the great men of Greco-Roman history. And I'm basing this kind of off of this ancient biographer, Plutarch, who tells the story of Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. And he's not a military historian, but he definitely has an eye for the dramatic battle scene. But the response has been really positive. You've been very encouraging over the DMs, and I really appreciate that. And yes. It's proven to me my thesis that the essence of these texts from antiquity, the right texts, that is this is the moral core of the West for manly excellence. And whether you're in politics, military, business, this is like what it's been for centuries, since antiquity. And I, even in the kind of more dissident spheres, the regime dissident spheres, I see this kind of basic misunderstanding widespread that, we have this idea of a canon of great books. And there's a lot of great books accounts posting on Twitter and people talking about the great books. I think that's generally great, positive, but the fundamental concept of the canon of the West, of Western classics, is not great books. It's great men. if you look at a guy like Homer, it's not about celebrating, like there's like, so a canon is this measuring stick. This is the word, the metaphor in Greek, that you measure yourself up against something. And what you're measuring yourself up against in Homer's world is not, books. It's the heroes of the past, and the books give you access to that. But really, there's like a canon that we've really lost touch with, even today, even among the people who are kind of great books enthusiasts. I think that like we really need to get back to celebrating heroes and studying them. And it doesn't mean worshiping them as saints or anything. But that's what I'm working on now.
And that's actually what attracted me to your project, in all seriousness, way back when, was that your project was not simply recounting the stories of these men past. It was heroes, men of excellence, etc. Agathos or agathoi, right?
Right.
But it was actually, leveraging that experience of the past and placing it in the present. And military men, for better or for worse, they're all about pragmatic application.
Yeah.
And, I am one of those men, and I believe that one of the greatest things that I really loved about your project is that, for instance, one of the great readers of the Plutarch's Lives that you told me about, Harry Truman, right, was always leveraging the stories of men past, not because of the book itself, but because of the acts that they did, not simply as instruction to doing certain things in certain circumstances, but rather that men dared and were bold and did thus, and that you can too. And I feel like in military training, for instance, there's this psychological praxis where the reason why you do training is not so much that you're learning how to do the practical application, but you're doing so under duress and stress. And knowing that those before you did that prior to you makes you kind of almost couch your courage, right? And for me, that's what the greats of the ancients were, and what we measure ourselves to is that these heroes of the past, these true, real heroes that existed, are maybe indicators of people that we can emulate, because they ran the same risks. I mean, they ran life and limb risks with family members being killed on their behest or on their quests, and sharing in the same kind of tragedy of life. And I think the reason why, quote unquote, the enemy wants to take away this canon and to smear their image is because they don't want men and women of high-spiritedness, thumos, to emulate their endeavors, because then that makes you uncontrollable, because then that makes you powerful. And which is why I've grafted onto your project like a leech. I love it, because it's like I feel like I'm almost, in the words of Bap, going back to this well and supping from a spiritual, I don't know, elixir, and pushing it forward onto our time and gushing forward and bringing back men of the stripe of Achilles and Hector and Diomedes and so on, and of course the Peloponnesian War and Rome, more especially, because I love Rome, obviously, if you couldn't tell. But I guess this kind of transitions into the modern time, and as much as Francis Fukuyama might hate it, and Francis Fukuyama and I have this huge beef. He doesn't know I exist, but I hate him nonetheless, since I was 14 and I read his books. But he believed that the end of history happened, right, in the 90s, and it was over, and that basically it's liberal hegemony forever, corporate scotocracy, forever. And that ultimately, I think what ended up happening was an empire in retreat in the 2000s, later after this war ended in Afghanistan. And finally, of course, the privatization of war and private military applications. And I know, for instance, I come from a military family, and there are many, even within my family, who are obviously patriotic, but also are critical of maybe using what they call mercenaries. And I think one of the greatest condottieri of our time, Erik Prince, right? He is a great balance between the two, where he's actually a patriotic asset, but also able to use free market, applications to our political issues abroad, and to be able to, champion the American cause abroad and further our diplomatic and economic and political aims. And I guess I wanted to pick your brain as far as, going back to the Roman Empire, I can just imagine our circumstances really, I don't know, resonate with me as far as the late Roman Republic, where you have Cicero, the conspiracy of Catiline, and then finally you have Marius and the Gracchi, and it feels like so many of our characters are bound up, especially our political candidates are bound up in that kind of dynamic. And I wanted to pick your brain. When do you think is the most synergistic time in Rome, and where do you think going down this route of maybe privatizing military could actually help us?
That's fascinating questions. And, you wonder, what the first thing that comes to mind is, this idea of an empire in retreat. Like, you think about the Persians in the 5th century BC. I bet a lot of them thought that they were at the end of history, and it kind of, for maybe some similar reasons, there is a really significant rise in mercenary activity around the end of the 5th century BC and around the kind of end of the Peloponnesian War, where this is the time of Socrates and Alcibiades and Xenophon. And Xenophon actually comes to mind to me as a kind of, figure who is a very careful, close observer of this kind of decrepit Persian empire that he sees the chinks in the armor of. And he ended up being a mercenary fighting in this sort of definitely failed coup attempt on behalf of this challenger to the Persian throne named Cyrus the Younger, whose brother was kind of older but weak and incompetent, and Cyrus thought he could do a better job, and he was certainly right, but he ended up dying in the battle that he won against his brother, and so the cause was lost. And Xenophon was at that battle in Iraq today. And it's interesting, like, Xenophon wrote a book called the Cyropaedia. He wrote a book called The Education of Cyrus, which is actually about this other Cyrus, Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire. And at the end of that book, he talks about how Cyrus was a great man, but the Persians today fall very far short of his example. And Alexander the Great actually famously took the Cyropaedia along with him when he was conquering the Persians. And so I think that, like, he kind of got that message from Xenophon of, here's how you can be a great man, and the Persians are really weak and vulnerable. That's from the same text. But yeah, I think, Xenophon really is an interesting figure for the whole private military contractor mold, because, there are all these Greeks kind of floating around the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean in his day. Athens and Sparta have just had this huge war, and they've used mercenaries in many of the conflicts. And then the war ends, Sparta wins, and you've got all these guys who are highly trained, and, like, what do they do? And kind of similar to how probably a lot of people today, the conflicts of the 90s, American activity in Afghanistan or Iraq, a lot of people with, like, highly developed skill sets and, looking for other opportunities to use them. And there's some good opportunities, there's some bad opportunities, I'm sure. I don't know that much, you know much more about this world than I do. But one of the things that really strikes me about Xenophon, he tells his story of his mercenary expedition in this book called the Anabasis, or the Ascent Upland, or sometimes it's called the Persian Expedition. So the story begins when he and his Greeks win this battle. There's like 10,000 Greek mercenaries. They win this battle, but Cyrus dies, and so they're kind of screwed, and they're in hostile territory, and they got to basically fight their way out up through Armenia to the Black Sea, and then on the way home. Well, especially like as you get further on in that book, when they finally are kind of re-entering the Greek world in the Black Sea, along the coast at least, there's some Greek colonies, and they're kind of like re-entering what they would call civilization. There's this constant tension between, all right, we're like a moving pirate army, and we can do whatever the hell we want. This is, it's a free for all. This is the Wild West or the Wild East. It's lawless. we have way more firepower than any of these little podunk tribes or even these little Greek city-states on the one hand. On the other hand, the Spartans rule the seas, and they won the Peloponnesian War. They're the regional hegemon. And so Xenophon is constantly like trying to rein in his mercenaries and remind them, hey, we want to go back home someday. Even if we don't go back home, and even if we want to found our own city here on the Black Sea coast, and there were ideas to do that, we got to have a reputation as not as being pirates, but as being like men of justice who respect the gods and who keep their commitments when they arrange them. And so, for example, just one story, they're somewhere along the Black Sea coast, and one of his guys, this like Spartan allied, I think he's an Arcadian, some kind of like Spartan military contractor, sails up, and he's like, they get in a fight with this guy. Mm-hmm. One of Xenophon's soldiers gets in a fight with this guy. Rocks end up being thrown. It turns out the guy was like trying to steal some sheep, just like a bad liar of a dude. But he was in the good graces of the Spartans. And so like after they have this fight, the guy like runs off and sails off. And Xenophon's soldiers everybody knows he's going to go tell on them to the Spartans, to the Spartan navarch, right?
Yeah.
And the soldiers, like Xenophon calls a meeting. He's like, hey, we got a real situation here, guys. And a lot of the other captains like, yeah, what do we need with the Spartans? We're a pirate army. Screw them. Screw that guy on the horse he rode in on. But Xenophon says, no, if we get a reputation for being like a pirate army, we're totally screwed, and the Spartans are going to squash us like a bug.
Right.
And so, what he does is he says, all right, here's what we have to do. The navarch is going to come. We have to submit to his justice. We have to like surrender. You have to surrender yourself. I'll surrender myself. And we'll say, let's like lay out a case and you be the judge of this. And it ends up working out. They end up, getting acquitted, so to speak, by the Spartan navarch. And kind of, it's just like, there's so many stories of struggles like this where they're just like on the brink of just totally going rogue and being completely shut out from society. I think this is like a problem that any private military contractor throughout history has kind of faced. Like, justice is really important to hold an army together. But it's, there's all these temptations. Your reputation is kind of in the hands of people who are just going to tell stories about you, and you don't have a lot of control over that, but you got to do what you can do. So there's a lot of lessons there in Xenophon.
Yeah, I mean, it also comes to mind the time when Pompey the Great actually, on his own merits, raised legions without the permission of the Senate. And in a certain way, I mean, technically speaking, it was sanctioned later, if I remember correctly, but, at the time was unprecedented, also illegal, and in a certain way it was a private army, right? And ultimately it was Pompey that ended up, I don't know, you pronounce it Pompey. I don't know what the correct pronunciation is.
Both work, yeah.
Yeah, but handsome, blonde, strapping dude at the time, just took matters into his own hands, and it was because of him that he was able to sustain the Republic. But also he had to balance, of course, the image he set with the Senate, which is, of course, not being seen as an outlaw or a rogue. And I think it's very interesting seeing the dynamic playing out with Erik Prince, because from what I understand, in his past, he had to liquidate Blackwater due to some, let's say, nefarious intrigues with elements of Western governments. And, obviously it's unfortunate, but he came back from that, and he was always playing ball. And, of course, I think maybe they went a little bit too far. And I guess the question remains, and this is an age-old debate, you hear this and read this in Machiavelli, can, private contractors be a boon to the state and help the Republic, our Republic especially? Or do you think, in general, do you believe that the national army should be something that we sustain and should be the primary. Because that's something that we're kind of coming back to. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's a massive recruiting crisis, in addition to a massive veteran community who is willing and looking for opportunities to ply their trade, just as Xenophon did back in the day. And I guess we're finding ourselves increasingly put in a corner against a rising, I guess, pact of major countries, and Russia, the PRC, in Iran. And I guess I wanted to pick your brain as far as times in ancient Rome that maybe taking the initiative and going into private military contracting actually helped save the Republic. If you can tell us at that time.
Yeah, well, very thorny issue, and I love this idea of Erik Prince as a kind of modern day Xenophon. We were talking a little bit before the call. I was telling a friend the other day, I like what his sister did as the Secretary of Education, but we need some Erik Prince energy in higher ed to straighten things up. So I like him for leading the Department of Education with some execution. Yeah, so Rome generally in the Republican period, they do have extensively, they rely on allies to staff their armies. A lot of these are Italian allies who are not Roman citizens. As things go on, you get like Gallic allies, especially like auxiliary cavalry. They'll often recruit locally. The horses are already there, and you're usually, if you're going to recruit auxiliary cavalry, say Caesar does this a lot in Gaul, you're going to get the cream of society fighting for you generally. Oh yeah, which is a great thing politically too, because you want to kind of Romanize these guys and get them on your side. But it was a big problem for Rome to not have citizens fighting in their armies. That they managed it for centuries, but eventually it came to a head in what's called the Social War, which literally means the war with the allies. The Soci are the allies in the 80s BC, the 91, I think it breaks out to 88, and basically the Roman allies throughout Italy, they keep getting promised citizenship and political rights from various politicians in Rome, and people keep just blowing them off and letting them down, and so they end up just rising up violently. And these are like top Roman generals who know everything about the Roman military machine. So it's just bloody, slogging Romans, basically fighting Romans, at least tactically, right? And it's bloody, and so they, this reliance on, I wouldn't call them like, I don't know, private military contractors. There's a kind of an analogy there. It ends up kind of coming about because Rome already has this huge problem of like internal political infighting, which is the pressure just keeps rising on the populists versus the optimates, the kind of traditional nobility versus the the people who are trying to court the favor of the Roman plebs. And the Social War is the first bad symptom of that, because it's a kind of a political ball that each side keeps tossing back and forth, and nobody really wants to commit on this issue. But then, the allies rise up in Italy, and at the same time, once that crisis starts happening, other crises start popping up too. And this is at a time when Rome rules most of the Mediterranean. I mean, they don't control Egypt, but they've got like basically the rest of the whole coast of the Mediterranean. And so, you've got, after this, I mean, it's a long story, but basically immediately after the Social War, the first Roman Civil War breaks out, which the conflict between Sulla, the dictator, and Marius, the general, one of my favorite figures from Roman history, Sulla. But, while they're facing this internal conflict of the Social War and then the Civil War, that's when Mithridates strikes. That's when their kind of greatest nemesis of the first century BC, this king from Pontus, which is in Asia Minor, leads this revolt and they murder tens of thousands of Roman citizens in Asia. It's like a Kristallnacht, this massacre, all orchestrated on one night. And then they sweep into Greece, and like Rome is really at risk of losing, like a third of its empire and the richest part, because that's where like it's all the merchants and it's great land and all this gold, et cetera, et cetera. So it really gets serious when in the late 80s BC. As a result of these internal conflicts, that's when your enemies start to attack, right?
Right.
Shortly after that, that's when Sertorius leads the slave revolt. So, yeah,
I actually wanted to ask
being
you
a big issue
because I mean, obviously you're not blind. You look at our American Republic, and you've been around the block for longer than I have, and I think you can see how much we've almost like really grown apart domestically, and also how galvanized our enemies and adversaries are abroad. And I feel like there are a number of elements that have parallels to the Roman past, especially in the crisis, the social crisis, and as well as going into the conflict between the populares and the patricians and all that good stuff. And it really calls to mind almost a situation where it's just like you said, Sulla was sent off to Bithynia and to defeat Mithridates, and it's almost like Marius is cleaning up house right now. In our parallel life, if that makes sense, it takes under the presidency of the current presidency, cleaning out justices, going through the institutions, for instance, and displacing people that otherwise are not friends, and it feels like, is there an opportunity for a Sulla? Did Sulla ultimately fix the problems of the Roman Republic? And I mean, what do you see? What's your read?
Yeah, I did a post on this about a year ago, and so there's this conversation between Elon Musk and David Sachs, and Sachs posts something about how like if you look at what our oligarchs are doing in the provinces, so to speak, like profiteering off of, say, Ukrainian conflict among the Biden family.
Right.
So his argument went like, it's actually very similar to what the Roman senatorial oligarchs were doing in a place like Africa with the Numidian War around the hundreds BC, and they're a politician like Jugurtha, or a warlord like Jugurtha, can essentially commit all kinds of abuses in the province. He's a client king, and he like murders a brother-in-law of his, and then he ends up beating up on some Roman merchants, and he gets off without any punishment because he's paying off the oligarchs back in Rome. He's the one who famously said, Rome is a city where everything is for sale. So and so David Sachs just kind of like posts this Wikipedia article. He's like, hey, same thing. And then Elon says in response, maybe what we need is a modern day Sulla.
I remember that. That was pretty spicy. What was your take on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I had just come out with the biography of Sulla on the Cost of Glory. So I was like, this is catnip for me. But, so basically, Sulla's, what he did first, most relevant to the Jugurtha problem, he's the guy that was credited with capturing Jugurtha. Marius was the general, and actually Sulla was his friend at that time. He was like a protege of Marius. Marius was the general, but Sulla's the guy who actually led this really daring kind of spy mission almost, that I recounted in the kind of episode 1 of the life of Sulla, to trick Jugurtha and seize him with his guard down. So Marius and Sulla are on the same team then, but then they end up having this falling out after the Jugurthine War about 20 years later. They're the two parties to the civil war. And then famously so Marius takes Rome when Sulla's off east fighting Mithridates. He seizes power in Rome and basically declares Sulla a public enemy, and has a few of Sulla's friends murdered. maybe was a couple dozen people that he ended up
Yeah.
having, political, which it sounds like a lot, but for the
No,
Romans,
that's
that's
nothing.
many.
That's nothing. It's not enough.
And so Sulla comes back, and after he defeats Mithridates, while being completely cut off from supplies and communications from Rome, amazingly, I mean, just the odds were so stacked against him, and he pulled it off, which I find them probably the most inspiring part of Sulla's story, that he defeats this powerful Greek king with just 4 legions. And so he comes back, and he, long story short, he wins the civil war, incredibly bloody, and it's horrible, and hundreds of thousands of people die. Not trying to sugarcoat that, but then Sulla, he goes on this, like, okay, he saw what Marius did, and he said, all right, that was kind of sloppy, and so he orchestrates the proscriptions, which is
Yeah.
writing up the names of his enemies on a list in the forum, and anybody whose name is on that list is basically, there's a bounty on their head, and their property gets confiscated. And so Sulla is most famous for that. He ends up executing in grand total more than 1,000 of the richest men in Rome.
Wow.
And the richest, most powerful men in Rome, and their sons are debarred from office, and their sons of sons. They're like, their whole like family line is kind of extirpated from the Roman political scene. And
Isn't
he
this
also
where Caesar gets also messed up with? Also, I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, so it's the aftermath is kind of complicated, but so let's get to Caesar in just a moment, because like this is, so Sulla does all this stuff, and he has himself declared dictator, and it's quasi legal, and on the one hand, Marius was a lot more gentle, you could say, but Sulla, like, you got to admit it kind of worked. The Optimate faction, Sulla's an Optimate, he's a noble,
Right.
and he just really clears out all of the opposition for an entire generation. And he does a few constitutional reforms, which actually a lot of them get undone pretty quickly, not all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And then he lays down his power as dictator. Famously, he doesn't make himself dictator for life, and then he dies shortly thereafter. But so Sulla is like a hero for a lot of people at the time, and yet his whole legacy is kind of tarnished by this fact that he was basically a mass murderer in the eyes of a lot of people. And so but that's Julius Caesar comes along, and he takes up this champion role of the populist cause that was the anti-Sulla cause, the Marius cause. And he says, they end up having a civil war, he and Pompey, in the 49 BC, and he says, I'm the unsulla. I'm not gonna wreak vengeance on my enemies. And he's famous for his clemency, which was a mixed legacy of its own, because while it got him a lot of honor from his contemporaries and from posterity, it was the people that he spared that ended up murdering him, right? So Augustus Caesar, his son-in-law, or his adoptive son, took the Sulla route instead.
It reminds me of modern politics. For instance, Stalin, the great saying, "No man, no problem." And I think Caesar is great in a lot of ways, because he almost becomes a martyr, really, in a lot of ways, because of the way he died, and because of his clemency, of course, and his great expedition eastward. But I kind of wanted to refocus here and maybe think of some parallels. And I was just thinking in my mind, Elon Musk, could he possibly be our Crassus? Is Erik Prince our Pompey? Who's our Julius Caesar? Or maybe it's confused, and maybe Erik Prince might be our Caesar. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I mean, Crassus was obviously he's the richest man in Rome, at least for part of his career, and he's a subtle operator. He's more of a behind the scenes guy, interestingly, and I think that he knew how to play that. He's Julius Caesar's main financier. He's the reason that Julius Caesar rose to power in a lot of ways. I'd like to see a guy like Elon funding nice humanitarian efforts to make our country great again. And well, there's another parallel that struck me that I ended up did a little thread on this a couple of weeks ago that ended up really catching fire to my surprise. Well, it wasn't that surprising, I guess, given the context, but like, right, the day after Trump is found guilty.
Oh yeah.
On whatever 40 counts or something.
Right. Yeah.
Well, it just struck me that this is kind of how the civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey starts, in a way, because what Julius Caesar, with the kind of like red line, or the unresolvable issue that they have between themselves, is Caesar is coming back from his campaign in Gaul, his tour of duty is ending. He's conquered all of France. It's amazing. And he's just poured wealth into Rome, and he's given them eternal glory. And all of his enemies at home are like, yeah, but you crossed outside of your province with a legion without permission from the Senate, and we're going to prosecute you for your crimes.
Right, and it's not like it was unprecedented either. There are multiple other instances of generals and proconsuls crossing borders in the same way, but of course the implications are extremely political, and only superficially are they infringements on the interests of the Senate, correct?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I mean, he had done a lot to piss the Senate off earlier in his career, and so it had been a decade coming, but he made the case in a lot of his writings afterward that there was this cabal of people who just personally hated him out of envy. And I think that's partly true, that people just wanted to bring Caesar down, and they were not shy about it.
Yeah.
And so he was trying to basically have an exception made so that he could run for the consulship and ad absentia, which would make him immune, because like the Romans had immunity for executive office holders,
right,
during their term. And so Pompey was in the mood to make concessions at first, but then he got people like Cato and Domitius Ahenobarbus, the like hardliners, talking in his ear and saying, "Oh, Caesar's gonna bring down the Republic, Pompey. You can't give him an inch." And so Pompey kind of ends up taking this hard line with his former friend. And so basically this issue of like whether Caesar can get immunity from prosecution from his invidious foes in the Roman Senate is what forces the issue and makes him march on Rome, because they kind of reach a dead end.
It's interesting because I have this conversation with my peers, veterans, etc. And when I talk to them about Rome, the image that's conjured in their minds about Rome is this marble white Senate with togas pristinely pressed and men of upright virtue and all that good stuff. But they don't know that Rome was a sweltering and dirty whore as well, and that ultimately, just as today, for instance, a lot of, let's say there's like, partisan gangs, let's say, that do political biddings out in the streets. So
yes,
too did that exist in Rome, and in the form of the collegia. And also Pompey, for instance, he himself contracted gladiators and other men of his previously discharged veterans to fight in the streets and to intimidate rivals. And I think Cicero was one of those famous men cowed into submission by these kind of, I guess, asymmetric forces. But the reason why I bring this to light is that, and I really want to wrap it up right here, is that this is why I love your project, because really what you confer to the listener is this idea that what we're living now, right in our present time, is not unprecedented. In fact, it's been lived thousands of times before, and it's well recorded in history. And these great men and what they did in the circumstances which they were challenged with, the obstacles, for instance. And, I think you make a really great job of making sure people understand how truly, I guess, human these men were, and how much they were faced with a lot of the same apprehensions, a lot of the same dangers. Their family members were killed for their political actions, or themselves were killed, or they had to deal with intimidation, worry, stress, all this kind of stuff. And I think in a war, for instance, and especially in training, we emphasize a lot about training under duress, being able to think while under stress, and to stay the course if it's the right course, under great odds, and being able to overcome even what might seem as great odds, and you can conquer them no matter what if you believe in yourself and you have that power fuck example, and that's why I turned them onto your podcast. And I guess I wanted to just leave it with you, first of all, to thank you for giving us almost a spiritual well, because for so many people reading the classics can be really dry, and for many more people it can feel not real. It can almost feel like these men belong to the gods. They don't belong to us. And I just wanted to appreciate you first of all, to make these guys men, and men who I'd want in my platoon. But lastly, I wanted to leave you with, I guess, if you could make a message to our legionaries out there who are listening to you to give them hope, what would you say?
Yeah, well, thank you for your kind words. I was reminded as you were talking about Rome and marble statues, that there's this moment where Cicero gets really frustrated with Cato the Younger, and he says Cato acts like he's living in Plato's Republic rather than Romulus's shithole. And I think that's one of the things that studying the Romans in particular, certainly the Greeks, but like you get this sense of like how dirty politics can be, and it kind of lets the scales fall from your eyes. And I think that's really important for everybody, especially in a time of crisis when the stakes seem high. It's just going to get dirtier, and you don't want to be a Nancy. And so I think my exhortation to people with the heroes of antiquity is like, if you are a Westerner, or just even a Westerner in spirit, this is your birthright. If you speak English, like, this is for you. And it's like our library of great examples that will fortify you. And I think it's true what you say about like the encouragement that you get from stories of extreme suffering. And I had this experience when I was late in my graduate career. I was like, I gotta read all of Homer in Greek. But I'm just a putz. What am I doing? Like, I call myself a classicist, and I haven't read all of Homer in Greek. And so I started this kind of like morning ritual, almost like sitting down with your Bible. But it was Homer's Iliad, and it kind of dawned on me that Homer, the Iliad in particular, so like, I think I would say estimating at least half of the book is like spears going through eyeballs and stuff. It's just this vivid, gory detail of the horrors of battle and people cackling over you as you fall into the dust. And I think that is, for me, I suddenly realized this is the origin of philosophy, which is to meditate on your own death. It's there to fortify you for the horrors you're going to face in your life. And that's one of the things that I really get out of the stories, not just of the Iliad, which is, fictional, arguably, but, the stories of the great men of Greece and Rome, is just this kind of, I don't know, it gives me a lot of courage and like fortitude. I think of Sertorius swimming the Rhone River in his full armor after all of like 10,000s of his comrades have been slain by the Cimbri barbarians, and he manages to survive. And just, there's so many. I think Sertorius is a great tale of survival against all odds too. But I think that this, to me, this is important. I can just speak from my own experience, right, that reading Plutarch is therapy. This is why I don't need a therapist, and there's a couple of other podcasts that I really like How to Take Over the World is a really good one with some more modern figures. But I consume this stuff as an entrepreneur now, as a dad, as somebody who's really like scared about what the hell is going to happen in this country. Like, this stuff is here to fortify you, and that's why it was copied over for centuries, not to give you some kind of refinement or to make you able to seem learned or to be a kind of deft dissector of geopolitics. You can get all that, but the fundamental use of the great stories of the past is to fortify you to face the present with courage. And that's what it's there for. And I'm glad that people like Quintus Curtius are bringing this out. I'm glad that, you know, you're seem to be tuned into that frequency, and I hope more will join along.
Oh, 100%, and absolutely. And I just wanted to thank you, Alex, seriously, for coming on. And I just wanted to give a message to you legionaries out there. Follow Cost of Glory. Follow Alex Patcast. I know he's going to freaking conquer the world. I know also, in addition to everything else, I think one of the recurring themes, of course, is leadership, especially in Lance's Legion, and the talk that one man can be 10,000 if he is best, right? And I just wanted to appreciate you for being 1 million. Thank you for changing our lives and for continuing on the fight. I know it's challenging. I know that there's a lot of pressure. I know that the future might be uncertain, but what you're doing is going to change millions of lives. So I just want to say thank you on behalf of the Legion. Salve.
Thank you, Lance. Salve. Keep doing good work.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much, Legionaries. This is the War Room, Alex Petcast, and of course Sergeant Barnes looming menacingly in the background. Signing off.